I would like to invite our first keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Arshad Hussain. Professor Dr. Arshad Hussain has over 20 years extensive international experience in academia and industry. He did his MS and PhD in chemical engineering from Germany. He has also worked as a senior researcher with State Oil Norway and Petronas Malaysia on the process design and feasibility analysis of CO2 capture from natural gas and flue gases by using polymeric membranes. He has published more than 80 journal and conference papers. His contributions in university-industry interactions and international collaboration is of paramount importance. He has the singular distinction of fetching a mammoth funding to the tune of rupees 48 million under Park Norway Industrial Corporation program for CO2 capture from natural gas and flue gases by using polymeric membranes. His extracurricular activities are worth mentioning for being Associate Editor of NJES, Conference Secretary SAM, member of the European Membrane Society and American Institute of Chemical Engineering, besides being Peloton of Nurse Literary Society. I would like to hand over to Professor Dr. Arshad Hussain, please. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zaid, for the nice introduction. Thank you very much, everyone. It's indeed a privilege to be part of this very first conference organized by Pakistan Membrane Society. It's a great effort, starting with such a extensive conference with an extensive program in this hard time of pandemic. So the time is really very short for the presentation, so I will directly head to the presentation. The topic of my presentation is identification and validation of transport parameters in tubular inorganic membranes. You are all aware of these membrane reactors. You know, the membrane reactors are basically a single equipment, single operators which can combine the reaction process and the product separation simultaneously. As we combine both reaction and the separation, so we can enhance the selectivity and conversion in this manner. The catalyst can be, either coated on the surface of the inorganic membrane, or it can be packed as a, particles within the tube or in the membrane. The membrane needs to be organic because in the partial oxidation reaction, which is usually the purpose of using these membrane, these are reactions which take place at a very high temperature. So the membrane needs to be inorganic so that it can sustain the high temperatures. Then the membranes are usually multi-layer asymmetric structure because they provide stability and the transfer selectivity of oxygen, which is used as oxidizing agent. To design a membrane reactor, it is important that we understand the heat and mass transfer phenomena in the membrane. And once we understand the heat and transport process in the membrane, and we need to identify what are the heat and mass transfer parameters which influence the transport process within the membrane. So therefore, there's a requirement that we identify and validate these transport parameters within the membrane. And since the time is very short, so I would be focusing only on the identification and validation of mass transfer parameters within the tubular inorganic membranes. Just to give an idea of what's the size of what's the configuration of the membrane is. These are tubular membranes made of aluminum oxide. So basically the support is made of alumina, and the inner dia is 21 millimeter of the tube, and outer dia is 32 millimeter of the membrane. And then this membrane is placed within a metallic shell so that it gets a concentric configuration. And the membrane has 4 layers, starting with the support layer, which has a 3 micron pore dia, and then another layer which has 1 micron, and 69 nanometer and 10 nanometer pore dia. This on the right side of the presentation, as you see, there is a experimental setup in which we have placed the membrane in a measuring cell, as it shows here, and then we have different temperature indicator, pressure, and the gas cylinders which feed the gas.
Excuse me, Dr. Arshad, can you please make it slideshow?
Sure. I thought it's already in the site. Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So as you see in this slide, so these selected two experiments. The first one is the single gas elimination experiment, which we call as an identification experiment. And then the other one is isobaric diffusion experiment, which we can label it as a validation experiment. So what's happening in the single gas experiment, formation experiment, as you see that a single gas passes in the shell, in the annulus, and then it permeates through the membrane and it leaves the tube side, and its velocity is measured. So we have pressure on the inner side and the outer side, and through this pressure difference, we can identify two membrane parameters, which are K0 and B0. I will be talking about these parameters in the next slide. And then we have isobaric diffusion experiments where two different gases. One is a lighter gas. In this experiment, it's a helium, and one is a heavier gas. In this experiment, it's a nitrogen. So both gases, one flows in the tube and the other flows on the annulus. Both gases pass through the membrane configuration. The lighter gas diffuses, and the both gas velocities and their compositions are measured. Dusty gas model is used to measure the fluxes through these membranes. This dusty gas model, as the name itself suggests, it's based on the assumption that the membrane is a cloud of dust through which the gas passes. So if you look at this slide, on the right-hand side of the slide, there are two driving forces. One is the mole fraction, or the concentration, and the other is pressure. And on the left side of the equation, so we have two fluxes, resulting fluxes. One is because of the Knudsen diffusion, and the other flux is coming from the molecular diffusion, or the effective diffusion of two gas components. These are the boundary conditions for the gases flowing in the annulus and in the tube, and these are some of the definitions of the parameters which we are using. For example, we said K0 and B0 are the primary parameters which we would be identifying and validating through these experiments. So starting with the first experiment, this is the single gas formation experiment. Now this dusty gas model equation has been simplified because of this is a single gas experiment. So the boundary diffusion component, or the molecular diffusion, the terms relating to the molecular diffusion have been dropped. So if you look at this equation, and then transforming this equation, taking the area of the cylindrical tube. So this equation shows that we have on the left side molar flow rate divided by delta P, the pressure drop, and then the rest of the parameters here. So what's happening here, a single gas, like in our case, we are using air, nitrogen, and helium, which is passing through the annulus. It permeates through the, in the tube side, and then it's measured, and we maintain certain delta P so that this transfer takes place. And then what we do, we plot this N over delta P on the ordinate and the membrane pressure, which is exerted on the membrane, on the x-axis. So what we have here, we have a slope and we have an ordinate. So the value of ordinate gives us the K0, which is called the Knudsen diffusion coefficient, and B0 is the viscous flow, the permeability constant. So by performing this experiment, we can identify these two parameters, K0 and B0. And if you look at this equation, rest are all the membrane configuration parameters like the length, the radius, and the the gas constant, the temperature, the molar mass of the gas, the viscosity of the gas. So basically, by plotting N over delta T versus membrane pressure, we can identify K naught and B naught. And once we have identified the K naught and B naught, we can calculate the pore dia of the membrane, and we can calculate the porosity to tortuosity ratio in the membrane. So this model equation helps us to identify, and this experiment, the single gas experiment, help us to identify the membrane parameters K naught and B naught, and through these parameters we can figure out the pore dia of the membrane and the ratio of porosity to tortuosity. Here in this slide, you see we have plotted this N over delta P value versus the membrane pressure, and for 3 different gases. As you see, the symbols show the measured values, and the full line shows the calculated values, and there is a nice agreement between the measured values and the calculated. And this diagram shows the experiments performed at different temperature for a single gas. And here, if you see, we are plotting, in this diagram, we plotted N over delta P versus pressure, average pressure. And here we have plotted N over delta P versus membrane temperature. And the experiments have been performed up to 500 Celsius. So this shows a very good fit that the identified parameters which are result of the experimental values are in good agreement with the calculations. Now, to further validate these parameters, in this table, as you see, we have 4 layers of the membrane. As you see, the support is alpha aluminum oxide. The first layer also, and the second layer, alpha alumina, and the third layer is made of gamma alumina. And these are the pore diameter which were given by the manufacturer of this membrane. That was a German company. They provided these membranes. These were the membrane thicknesses, and these are the 2 parameters, K naught and B naught, which we identified through the experiment. And through these parameters, we figure out the dP and the porosity to tortuosity ratio. And if you look at these values are pretty much in agreement to the pore dia which were given by the manufacturer. So this shows that this model equation can predict the pore dia in a reliable manner. Now, the next validation experiment is azobaryc diffusion. As the name itself suggests, there is no pressure drop. So 2 gases, as we mentioned earlier, nitrogen and helium, they pass through the membrane. So basically, helium is flowing on the annulus side, and nitrogen is flowing on the tube side. And we are measuring the composition and the flow of both gases. So the dusty gas model equation has been now modified because there is no pressure drop here. So the pressure term has been dropped, and these are the gas velocities which has been changed on the tube side, and this is the gas velocity of helium which has been fixed on the outer side of the membrane, which means on the annulus. And there, if you see in this slide, we see that there is a good agreement between the measured values and again the calculated values, which means these parameters which have been identified that can be successfully validated. And this diagram shows that how the inlet gas velocity is changing, and accordingly the mole fraction of helium in the tube and the mole fraction of helium in the annulus is changing. In this diagram, as you see, that we have a velocity change in the tube side, and accordingly how the helium mole factor is changing with respect to change in velocity. And this diagram also shows the velocity change both in the tube side and on the annulus side. So Since the time was very short, therefore I could only show you the validation of mass transfer experiments and particularly the single gas permeation as baric diffusion experiments. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'm available for that.